Before sunrise, the world is still cold. A thin line of smoke rises from a dwelling wall, pale against the dark morning sky. Inside, someone is already awake. A hand reaches toward the embers, careful not to waste their heat. Another hand lifts a basket from the shadows. Dried kernels shift softly against woven fiber. A grinding stone waits on the floor, worn smooth by years of work, by mothers and daughters, by grandmothers whose names may be lost to us, but whose movements remain in the stone. Outside, the land is quiet, but not empty. It holds seeds beneath the soil, fish beneath the river ice, deer moving between trees, roots sleeping under frost, berries remembered from the last warm season. To live here, 1,000 years ago, was not simply to search for food. It was to know when the first shoots appeared, when nuts would fall, when salmon might return, when the desert fruit would ripen, when the fields needed prayer, labor, and patience. Food was not separate from life. It was the calendar. It was the map. It was the memory of rain. Across the Americas, no single meal can speak for everyone. A family in the canyon country of the Southwest did not eat exactly like a fishing community along the Pacific coast. A village near the Great Lakes did not live on the same foods as farmers in Mesoamerica or highland communities in the Andes. Every region had its own knowledge, its own seasons, its own risks, and its own ways of turning the Earth's gifts into survival. But if we follow the smoke from many fires, if we listen carefully, we can begin to see the ancient table, not one table, but thousands. And among the foods people ate in America 1,000 years ago, some were gathered with stained fingers in summer light. 25. Berries. Before they were stored, before they were dried, before they were mixed into meals for harder months, berries were first a sign that the land had turned generous again. In some northern forests and wetlands, people gathered blueberries, cranberries, and other small fruits. In other regions, chokecherries, elderberries, serviceberries, or salal berries may have filled baskets, depending on the place and season. These were not casual snacks picked without thought. People knew where they grew, when they sweetened, which ones could be eaten fresh, which ones should be dried, which ones needed preparation, and which ones were never to be touched. Imagine a group moving through low brush in the late warmth of the year. Children may have been sent to help, their hands darkened with juice. Older gatherers watched the sky, the insects, the ripeness of the fruit. A basket filled slowly. A few berries were eaten immediately, bright and sharp on the tongue. Others were saved. Drying berries was a way of carrying summer forward. Laid in the sun, spread near smoke, or packed away after careful preparation, they could become part of winter food. A sweetness remembered when the fields were bare and the river ran cold. A berry seems small, but in a world without stores, without distant markets, without metal cans or glass jars, small foods mattered. A handful of dried fruit could brighten a meal. A basket gathered at the right time could become strength weeks later. And sometimes survival depended on remembering the small things. 24. Acorns. In some forested regions, especially where oak trees grew in abundance, acorns were far more than something that fell unnoticed underfoot. They were food, but only for people who understood them. An acorn is not easy generosity. Many acorns are bitter with tannins. To turn them into nourishment, communities developed careful methods: gathering, drying, cracking, grinding, and leaching the bitterness away with water. The work could take time. It demanded patience. It demanded inherited knowledge. Picture an autumn floor beneath great oaks. The air smells of dry leaves. Acorns strike the ground, one by one. People gather them not as desperate wanderers, but as skilled harvesters who know that the trees, in a good year, can feed many. Back at camp or village, shells are broken. Nut meats are sorted. Some are dried for storage. Some are pounded into meal. Water carries away what the body should not take in. What remains can be shaped into cakes, mush, or other foods, depending on local tradition. The lesson of acorns is quiet but powerful. Ancient food was often technology. Not technology of metal and wheels, but technology of attention, water, stone, time, memory. The difference between hunger and nourishment could be a method passed down through generations. A child watching this work would not only learn how to eat, they would learn how to trust the knowledge of the elders. 23. Hickory nuts, walnuts, and pecans. Where the forests offered nut trees, autumn could become a season of heavy baskets and careful storage. Hickory nuts, walnuts, pecans, and other regional nuts provided something precious: fat. Fat was not a luxury. It was warmth. It was energy. It was the strength to walk, hunt, grind, carry, build, and endure long, cold months. The sound of nuts being cracked would have been part of domestic life in many places. A steady rhythm near the fire, hard shell against stone, children watching, fragments swept aside. Nut meats could be eaten, pounded, mixed with other foods, or sometimes boiled to draw out rich oils. In some communities, nut preparations may have helped thicken meals or add depth to otherwise lean food. These were foods of patience. A person did not simply reach into the forest and come back with dinner ready to eat. The forest offered its wealth inside shells. People answered with skill. There is something deeply human in that sound, the cracking of nuts in a quiet home as evening settles. Outside, the wind moves through bare branches. Inside, hands keep working. Every small piece saved is a promise against hunger. 22. Pine nuts. Farther west, in the dry lands and mountain edges of the Great Basin and the Southwest, pine nuts from pinyon and related trees became important in some communities. They were rich, portable, and deeply tied to place. The harvest was not guaranteed every year. Trees have cycles. Weather matters, drought matters, timing matters. People had to know not only where the groves stood, but when they were ready. Imagine families moving toward pinyon country when the season was right. The air is resinous. Cones are gathered, warmed, opened. Seeds are shaken loose, roasted, cracked, eaten, stored. Their taste carries the scent of high, dry land, wood smoke, stone, sun, and dust. Pine nuts remind us that ancient diets were not random collections of whatever could be found. They were relationships. A grove might be known for generations. A route to harvest might be remembered in story. A good year might be spoken of long afterward. Food was geography made edible. And as the morning fire grows brighter in our opening house, as the grinding stone begins its steady sound, we should remember this: Before any meal reached the mouth, it had already passed through landscapes, seasons, hands, and memory. The ancient table was built long before anyone sat down to eat. 21. Mesquite pods. In the dry country, where heat could turn the air to glass and water was never taken for granted, some trees offered sweetness when sweetness was rare. Mesquite did not look like a field of grain. It did not stand in neat rows waiting for harvest. It grew with thorns and deep roots, holding itself in hard ground where other plants might fail. But among certain communities in the Southwest and nearby dry regions, mesquite pods could become food. When ripe, they could be gathered, dried, and ground into a meal with a naturally sweet taste. The work began by watching the tree. Not every pod was ready at once. Not every season gave the same abundance. A good gatherer knew the color, the dryness, the feel of the pod in the hand. The pods might be collected into baskets, spread out, and later pounded or milled into flour. Mixed with water, shaped into cakes, or added to other foods, mesquite could carry the taste of sun into the body. There is a lesson in mesquite that belongs to many dryland foods. Abundance does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides in thorny branches. Sometimes it asks people to bend close, to learn the difference between what is bitter, what is ready, and what can last. To an outsider, the desert may look empty. To the people who knew it, it was full of signs. 20. Cactus fruits and pads. In some arid regions, cactus was not only a plant to avoid, it was a seasonal food, a source of moisture, color, and careful harvest. The fruits of prickly pear could ripen into red, purple, or yellow brightness against a landscape of stone and dust. Their sweetness came protected by spines so fine they could punish careless hands. Pads, too, could be used as food in certain places, but they required skill, cutting, scraping, roasting, boiling, or other preparation, depending on local practice. Imagine the harvest at the edge of morning before the worst heat arrives. A person approaches with a tool, not bare hands. The fruit is twisted free, dropped into a container, carried back. Later, the spines are removed. Juice stains fingers. Seeds crack faintly between teeth. The flavor is not just sweetness, it is relief. In lands where water shaped every decision, a fruit with moisture inside it mattered. It could refresh. It could nourish. It could be eaten fresh or prepared in ways that extended the season's gift. But cactus also reminds us that ancient cooks were not merely taking from the land. They were negotiating with it. The plant gave food, but not without warning. It demanded respect. 19. Agave. Some foods were not cooked in minutes. They were transformed over hours, sometimes days, under earth and heat. Agave, in parts of the Southwest, northern Mexico, and other regions where it grew, could become an important food when prepared properly. Its thick hearts were not the kind of food a person simply picked and ate while walking. They were cut, trimmed, and often roasted in earth ovens with hot stones, covered and left to soften slowly. The scene is almost ceremonial in its patience. A pit is opened. Stones are heated in a fire until they hold the sun's memory inside them. Agave hearts are placed among them, covered with leaves, fiber, soil, perhaps more plant material. Then comes the waiting. Smoke seeps through the earth. Night passes. People sleep nearby or tend other work. Children may ask when it will be ready. Elders know that some foods cannot be rushed. When the pit is opened, the agave has changed. Toughness has given way to sweetness. Fibers pull apart. Steam rises into the morning air. What was sharp and guarded becomes edible through heat, time, and knowledge. Agave is one of those foods that makes the past feel close. You can almost smell the roasting pit. You can almost hear the first quiet conversation when the covering is removed. Food like this was not only nourishment, it was gathering. It was shared labor. It was a reason for people to come together around a fire before the meal existed. And once again, the deeper truth appears. Survival was not just finding food. It was knowing how to transform it. 18. Wild rice. Now the landscape changes. The dry air gives way to water, reeds, and the soft knock of wood against wood. In northern lake regions, especially around the Great Lakes and nearby waterways, wild rice was gathered by certain indigenous communities whose knowledge of lakes and marshes ran deep. It was not rice in the same sense as Asian cultivated rice, but a native aquatic grain. It grew in shallow waters, where canoes could pass gently through stands of tall plants. Harvesting required balance, timing, and restraint. Picture a canoe moving at dawn through mist. One person guides it forward with a pole. Another bends the rice stalks over the canoe and taps them with sticks. The ripe grains fall like rain into the bottom of the boat. The unripe grains remain, left for later, for birds, for reseeding, for the future. This was not careless taking. It was a harvest shaped by rhythm. After gathering came parching, threshing, winnowing, steps that turned the wild grain into food that could be stored and cooked. The work carried sound, the tap of sticks, the rustle of grain, the hiss of heat, the movement of hands separating hull from food. Wild rice tells us that water was also a field. A lake could be a garden without fences. A marsh could be a storehouse without walls. To live well there meant knowing the plants not from a distance, but from within the canoe, from the changing level of water, from the flight of birds, from the feel of the season. 17. Sunflower seeds. Long before sunflowers became symbols on modern postcards and garden fences, their seeds were food. In parts of eastern North America and beyond, sunflowers were among the plants indigenous communities cultivated and used. Their seeds offered oil, flavor, and energy. They could be eaten, ground, mixed into other foods, or processed in ways that made them more useful for cooking. A sunflower head, heavy with seed, is a quiet kind of abundance. It follows the season from green growth into golden maturity, then bends under its own weight. To harvest it is to gather many small futures at once. Imagine women and men cutting mature heads, carrying them back, drying them, loosening the seeds. The seeds scatter into baskets with a dry whisper. Some may be saved for food. Some may be saved for planting. In that simple choice, eat or preserve, lies one of the oldest tensions of farming life. Hunger asks for everything now. Wisdom saves something for later. Sunflower seeds also show how ancient food systems could include both wild knowledge and cultivation. The boundaries were not always the same as modern categories. People encouraged useful plants, selected them, planted them, tended them, gathered them, and folded them into daily meals. The earth was not merely a place people lived upon. It was a partner they studied, shaped, and depended on. 16. Goosefoot and chenopod seeds. Some of the most important foods of the past are almost invisible to the modern imagination. Goosefoot, or chenopod, was one of several seed plants used in ancient Eastern North American food traditions. Its seeds were small, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss if we imagine history only through large crops and dramatic hunts. But small seeds can carry a people through difficult times. In some regions, evidence suggests that communities gathered, tended, and eventually cultivated forms of these plants. The seeds could be parched, ground, or cooked into meals. They did not have the fame of maize or the modern familiarity of wheat, but they belonged to an older story of gardens, river valleys, and careful plant knowledge. Think of the work required. A person bends over seed heads in the late season. The air is dry. The plants rattle softly. Seeds fall into a container, tiny and numerous. Later they must be cleaned, separated from chaff, stored away from moisture and pests. None of this is effortless, but effort was the shape of food. Much of ancient life was built from what the modern eye might pass over. Seeds no larger than a breath, pods drying on thorn branches, bitter nuts made sweet by water, cactus fruit guarded by spines. These foods remind us that people did not survive because the land was easy. They survived because they knew it intimately. And somewhere, as evening settles over a village, a pot thickens near the fire. Seeds, meal, fruit, perhaps meat or squash. Each ingredient carrying a different landscape, a different season, a different memory. The meal is not grand in the way museums display grandeur. It is grand because it means another night of warmth, another child fed, another story told before sleep. 15. Fish and salmon. Where rivers ran strong, where lakes held cold depths, where coastlines opened into fog and salt wind, fish could mean life. In some places, people watched the water the way farmers watch the sky. They knew when certain fish moved, when the river changed color, when the banks became crowded with signs, when the season had turned. Along parts of the Pacific coast and in river systems across the continent, salmon and other fish were not just food for a day. They were food for the future. Imagine a river at first light. Mist rises from the current. The stones are wet and dark. People stand near weirs, nets, traps, spears, or platforms, depending on the region and tradition. The work is cold and dangerous. One wrong step on slick rock can send a body into water powerful enough to take it away. But the people here know the river. They have stood beside it before. Their parents stood here. Their grandparents may have taught them where the fish turn, where the current slows, where hands must be quick. A fish pulled from the water is bright for only a moment. Then the work begins. Some fish might be eaten fresh, roasted near flame, boiled in baskets or vessels, or cooked over coals. Others were split and dried. In certain regions, smoking and drying preserved fish for winter or for travel. Racks near the water could hold rows of flesh turning slowly from fresh catch into stored food. The smell would have been strong. Smoke, oil, river, salt, wood. It was the smell of survival being prepared. Fish carried more than protein. They carried time. A successful run could feed a household long after the river quieted. Dried salmon, dried fish, or other preserved catches could become trade goods, gifts, supplies for journeys, or insurance against hunger. And like all important foods, fish required respect. People understood that rivers gave, but not endlessly. The return of fish was something to be watched, honored, and remembered. A broken season could be frightening. An abundant season could bring relief that settled into the bones. 14. Shellfish. Along many coasts, estuaries, bays, and river mouths, the tide itself offered food. Shellfish, oysters, clams, mussels, and other species, depending on the region, could be gathered where water pulled back and revealed mudflats, rocks, and hidden beds of life. For some communities, these foods were part of regular meals. For archaeologists today, old shell deposits in certain places remain quiet evidence of meals eaten over generations. But to imagine shellfish only as piles of shells is to miss the living scene. The tide withdraws. The air smells of salt and wet earth. People move across the shore with baskets and digging tools. Feet sink into mud. Hands search beneath sand or pry at rock. Children learn which shells are worth keeping and which must be left. Elders know the safe seasons, the dangerous waters, the places where a bed should not be stripped bare. Shellfish could be roasted near fire, steamed under coverings, boiled, dried, or combined with other foods. They offered nourishment that did not require chasing an animal through forest or waiting months for a field to ripen. Yet even here, knowledge mattered. The shore had rules. The tide had timing. The water had moods. There is something intimate about shoreline food. It comes from the edge between worlds, not fully land, not fully sea. People who gathered it lived with that edge. They read clouds, moon, current, birds, and smell. They knew when the path would vanish under returning water. A shell opened by heat is a small thing, but thousands of such small things, gathered year after year, can tell a long story. Families returning to the same shore, fires lit against the wind, meals shared while gulls cried overhead. 13. Deer. In the forests, river valleys, and open woodland edges of many regions, deer were among the animals that could provide meat, hides, bone, sinew, and tools. But deer were not easy food. They were alert, fast, and deeply aware of the world around them. To hunt deer required patience. Picture a hunter moving before dawn, stepping where leaves will not crack loudly, reading tracks pressed into soft ground. A broken twig, a print near water, a place where bark has been rubbed. These signs mattered. Hunting was not only strength, it was observation, silence, endurance. And after the hunt, the work was communal. An animal brought back to camp did not become food by itself. It had to be skinned, cut, cooked, dried, rendered, shared. Meat could be roasted fresh, boiled, or preserved. Nothing valuable was wasted if people could help it. Hide could become clothing, coverings, containers. Bone could become tools. Sinew could bind. Fat could enrich lean meals. This is why meat in the ancient world should not be imagined as simple abundance. It came with danger, skill, and responsibility. A deer meant food, yes, but also labor, gratitude, and careful use. There may have been moments of relief when hunters returned successfully. The sound of people gathering, the first smell of meat near flame, children watching closely, elders perhaps remembering harder years when the animals were scarce or the weather turned against them. A meal of deer meat could warm the body, but the deeper nourishment came from the knowledge that the community had worked together, from tracking to cooking, from cutting to sharing, from hunger to evening rest. 12. Rabbits and small game. Not every meal came from great animals or dramatic hunts. Much of daily survival may have depended on smaller creatures: rabbits, hares, squirrels, birds, and other local game, depending on the region. These animals were not as impressive as bison, not as symbolically powerful as salmon, not as central to farming life as maize. But ordinary foods often carry the truest weight of daily life. Small game could be trapped, snared, netted, hunted with bows, throwing sticks, or other tools according to local traditions. It could be cooked quickly, added to stews, roasted over coals, or combined with plant foods to stretch a meal further. Imagine a cold afternoon when the larger hunt has failed. No deer has appeared. The wind has shifted. Tracks have been lost. But a snare line, checked carefully, may provide a rabbit. It is not a feast. It is not a story sung for generations. Yet it matters. It becomes broth. It becomes warmth. It becomes something placed in the hands of a child. Small game reminds us that ancient life was not only made of grand harvests and famous foods. It was made of countless modest successes. A few seeds gathered before rain, a handful of nuts saved from spoilage, one fish caught before sunset, one rabbit taken when the day seemed empty. Survival was built from these moments, and between the forests, rivers, shores, and fields, people lived by attention. They did not separate the world into nature and home the way many people do now. The forest was connected to the cooking fire. The river was connected to winter storage. The track in the mud was connected to the child sleeping under a woven covering. Food was the thread between them. 11. Bison. On the Great Plains and in other grassland regions, bison could stand at the center of life for certain communities. Not for every people in the Americas, not for every place, but where the herds moved and where human knowledge followed them across open land. To see bison only as meat is to see too little. A single animal carried weight, warmth, tools, shelter, and food. Its meat could be roasted fresh or dried. Its fat could enrich lean meals. Its hide could become robes, coverings, containers, and later, in some regions and periods, parts of lodges. Bones could become tools. Horn and sinew could be shaped into useful things. Nothing about such an animal was small. But the hunt was never simple. Imagine the plains under a hard blue sky. The grass bends in the wind like water. Far away, dark shapes move together, slow and powerful. To approach them required coordination, courage, and deep knowledge of land and animal behavior. Bison were not passive. They were massive, fast, and dangerous. A mistake could mean injury or death. Communities developed different strategies in different regions and times. Surrounds, drives, ambushes, and later methods that changed as technology and horses transformed life on the plains. Around 1,000 years ago, long before the full horse culture of later centuries, people still knew how to work together with precision, using terrain, timing, and planning. After a successful hunt, the landscape itself became a place of labor. Meat had to be cut quickly, fat saved, hides treated, portions shared. Strips of meat might be dried in the sun and wind, becoming food that could travel or last beyond the day. The smell of fresh blood, grass, smoke, and drying meat would have filled the air. There must have been relief in that work, but also solemnity. A bison was not taken lightly. It represented danger faced together and life extended through skill. And in the evening, when the fires burned low and the wind moved outside the circle of light, the people eating that meat were not merely consuming food. They were receiving the result of planning, courage, memory, and the animal's power. 10. Turkey. In parts of the Southwest, Mesoamerica, and other regions, turkeys were known to ancient communities, though their meaning and use changed across time and place. Among some ancestral Pueblo communities, evidence suggests turkeys were important for feathers before becoming more clearly important as a meat source in later periods. In Mesoamerica, domesticated turkeys had their own long story as well. So we should imagine turkey carefully, not as the modern holiday bird placed whole at the center of a table, but as a living presence near homes, fields, and courtyards. Picture a village morning. The sun has begun to warm stone walls. Turkeys move restlessly in enclosed spaces or near domestic areas, their feathers catching light. Someone scatters food scraps or watches them with practiced attention. Their calls break the quiet. Children know the sound. Feathers could matter deeply. They could be used for blankets, clothing, ritual items, or other forms of warmth and meaning, depending on community and region. A bird was not valuable only when eaten. Ancient people often understood usefulness in layered ways. A creature could offer warmth before it offered meat. It could be part of household life before it became part of a meal. When turkey was eaten, it would have added richness and protein to a diet that might also include maize, beans, squash, gathered plants, and hunted animals. Bones left behind in archaeological contexts can tell part of this story, but bones do not preserve the whole human experience. The sound of birds at dawn, the work of feeding them, the choices families made about when to keep and when to kill. Turkey reminds us that domestication was not only about control. It was relationship, observation, and gradual change. People lived close enough to these birds to understand their habits, their value, and their place in the household world. 9. Amaranth. In Mesoamerica and some other regions, amaranth was one of those foods that could be easily overlooked by modern eyes, yet deeply valued by ancient communities. Its seeds are tiny, but they are many. They can be toasted, ground, mixed, shaped, or cooked. In some traditions, amaranth held not only nutritional value, but cultural and ceremonial importance. It was a food of fields and hands, of harvest and transformation. Imagine the plant standing tall, its seed heads dense and heavy, sometimes red or golden in the light. When dry, the seeds loosen. They fall in abundance, small as dust and yet full of strength. Gathering amaranth was slow work. The seed heads had to be cut or beaten into baskets. The seeds needed cleaning, drying, and storing. A careless hand might lose much of the harvest to wind. A patient hand could gather enough to feed many. Near a cooking fire, Amaranth might become part of a porridge, a flour, or a mixture with other ingredients. It could thicken a meal. It could travel in stored form. It could add strength where strength was needed. There is dignity in foods like this, foods that do not dominate the imagination, but quietly sustain life. Ancient cooks understood that a meal was often built from many small contributions. A handful of seeds, a scoop of maize meal, a little chili, a piece of dried meat, a squash cut open after storage. Together, they became enough. 8. Quinoa. Far to the south, in the highlands of the Andes, another seed crop grew in a world of thin air, cold nights, and steep slopes. Quinoa belonged to high places. It was not a food of every ancient American community, and it should not be pulled out of its homeland and scattered carelessly across the whole continent. Its story is tied to Andean landscapes, to altitude, frost, stone, and fields that demanded resilience from both plants and people. Imagine the Andean morning. The light arrives sharply over mountains. Breath turns visible in the cold. The fields cling to slopes where clouds move low and fast. In such places, every crop had to be strong. Every harvest mattered. Quinoa, with its small seeds and hardy nature, helped feed communities who knew how to farm where the world seemed almost too severe for farming. The plants stood in colors that could glow against the earth: red, gold, pale, dark. When harvested and processed, the seeds required care. Bitter compounds on the outside could be removed through washing or other preparation. Once ready, quinoa could be cooked into nourishing meals, carried, stored, and combined with other Andean foods. In this landscape, food was an answer to altitude. The people who grew and ate quinoa were not simply surviving harsh land. They were building life within it, learning which slopes held moisture, which seasons brought frost, how to store what the fields gave, how to make a home where mountains shaped every breath. And when we speak of foods eaten in America 1,000 years ago, we should remember that the Americas were vast beyond easy imagination. Desert pods, lake grains, forest nuts, river fish, plains bison, village turkeys, Mesoamerican amaranth, Andean quinoa, each belong to its own world. Together, they do not make one simple menu. They make a continent of memory. 7. Potatoes. In the Andes, where mountains rise into cold air, and the ground can seem both generous and unforgiving, potatoes became one of the great foods of human history. But before the potato traveled the world, before it appeared in fields across Europe, Asia, and Africa, it belonged to the highlands of South America, to people who learned how to grow food in places where frost could arrive like a warning, and thin soil demanded patience. A potato does not shine above the ground like a fruit. It hides. Its life is underground, in darkness, swelling beneath leaves and stems while wind passes over the field. To harvest it, people had to reach into the earth itself. Hands broke soil apart. Fingers searched through loosened ground. Then the tubers appeared, rough-skinned, heavy, alive with stored energy. In the highlands, potatoes offered something powerful, food that could come from difficult land. Different varieties could suit different elevations, soils, and conditions. Some could be boiled. Some could be roasted in embers. Some, in Andean traditions, could be preserved through freezing and drying, using the cold nights and strong sun of the highlands to make food last far beyond the harvest. Imagine that process. Night settles over the mountains. The cold deepens. Tubers left exposed begin to freeze. By day, the sun returns, and people press out moisture, working with weather as if weather itself were a tool. What might seem harsh becomes useful. Frost, which can destroy, can also preserve when understood. That is the genius of ancient food knowledge. It did not always fight the land. Sometimes it listened to the land so closely that even hardship became part of the method. A pot of potatoes near a fire may look simple, but inside that meal is an entire mountain world. Elevation, frost, labor, storage, hunger held back by skill. The potato fed bodies, yes, but it also carried a lesson. Life can be rooted in places where survival seems uncertain, if people learn the ground deeply enough. 6. Cassava. Now the air grows warmer. The mountains fall away. The story moves into tropical forests, river basins, and humid lowlands, where another root fed many communities. Cassava, also known as manioc. Cassava is one of the most important foods of the tropical Americas, but it is also one of the clearest reminders that food can be dangerous before it becomes nourishment. Some varieties of cassava contain compounds that must be removed through careful processing. This was not a food for guesswork. It required inherited knowledge: grating, soaking, pressing, washing, drying, roasting, or baking, depending on the variety and local tradition. Prepared correctly, cassava could become flour, flatbread, cakes, or other staple foods. Prepared carelessly, it could harm. Think about what that means. At some point in the deep past, communities learned not only that this root could feed them, but how to make it safe. They developed tools and techniques. They taught children the steps. They recognized the difference between kinds of plants, between raw and ready, between danger and sustenance. A cassava root pulled from the soil is pale, heavy, and plain-looking. It gives no speech. It does not explain itself. The knowledge lives in the people. Imagine a household at work. Roots are washed. The outer skin is removed. The flesh is grated into wet pulp. Liquid drains away through woven presses or other devices. The pulp is dried, sieved, heated, turned into something that can be stored or eaten. The labor is repetitive, but it is not mindless. Every step matters. The room smells of damp earth, plant fiber, smoke, and heat. Cassava shows us that ancient cooks were chemists of daily survival. They may not have used modern language for toxins, starches, or processing, but they understood effects, sequences, and consequences. They knew that the body remembers mistakes. They knew that a safe meal begins long before cooking. In a forest region where grain fields might not define life the way they did elsewhere, cassava could anchor the household. It could be planted, harvested, processed, stored, carried, traded, shared. It helped make settlement possible in places where rain, heat, and dense growth shaped every movement. It was a root of patience and discipline. And like acorns, like agave, like wild rice, cassava tells the same truth again in a different language. The ancient table was built from knowledge. 5. Sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes carry a softer feeling in the imagination. Warmth, earth, sweetness. the smell of something roasting slowly until its sugars deepen. In parts of tropical America and South America, sweet potatoes were cultivated and eaten long before the modern world spread them widely. Their exact pathways of movement are complex, and scholars continue to study how far and how early they traveled. But in the ancient Americas, among certain communities, they were a valuable root crop. Unlike cassava, sweet potatoes do not usually require the same dangerous transformation to become safe. But they still required farming knowledge, planting cuttings, tending soil, choosing varieties, protecting crops, timing harvest, storing what could be stored. Imagine a patch of earth after rain. Vines trail low across the ground. Leaves catch droplets of water. Beneath them, hidden in the soil, the roots thicken. A person kneels and pulls one free, brushing dirt from its skin. It is not dramatic, it is not loud, but in the hand it carries comfort. Roasted in ashes, boiled, mashed, or combined with other foods, sweet potatoes could bring sweetness to a meal without honey, sugar, or modern ingredients. Their flavor was the flavor of stored sunlight, drawn quietly through leaves and buried underground. A child might remember that taste. Not every ancient food was harsh, bitter, or difficult. Some foods must have felt like kindness, soft after cooking, warm in the palm, filling in the stomach. In a world where hunger was always possible, sweetness was more than pleasure. It was reassurance. A roasted sweet potato split open near the fire gives off steam. Its flesh glows. Someone passes a piece to another person. Outside, rain begins again. Inside, for a moment, there is enough. 4. Chili peppers. Then comes fire of another kind. Chili peppers were among the great flavor plants of the Americas, especially in Mesoamerica and other regions where they were cultivated and used. They were not merely decoration, not a modern challenge of heat for its own sake. They changed food. They awakened it. Fresh, dried, smoked, ground, cooked into sauces, added to stews, or paired with maize, beans, squash, cacao, or other ingredients, chilies could bring warmth, sharpness, depth, and preservation value. Their heat carried across the tongue and into the body, especially in cool mornings or after long labor. Imagine a cooking area where dried peppers hang above the hearth. Their skins are wrinkled, dark red, brown, yellow, or nearly black. Someone selects one, breaks it open, shakes out seeds, toasts it briefly, grinds it with stone. The air changes at once. Eyes may water. The smell rises, smoky, sharp, alive. A meal without chili might feed. A meal with chili could speak. It could speak of region, family, preference, trade, and skill. Different peppers brought different kinds of heat and flavor. Some were bright and quick. Others were deep and smoky. A cook knew how much to use, when to add it, how to balance it with earthier foods. Chili peppers remind us that ancient cuisine was not just about calories. It was about taste, pleasure, identity. The memory of a household's way of cooking. Too often people imagine the distant past as flavorless, as if survival left no room for beauty. But ancient cooks knew seasoning. They knew aroma. They knew the difference between a pot that merely filled the body and a pot that made people gather closer. By the time the sun lowered and the day's work ended, a stew might simmer near the fire, beans softening, maize thickening the broth, squash breaking down into sweetness, chili rising through it all like heat from the earth itself. And as people ate, they were not only staying alive, they were tasting home. 3. Cacao. In Mesoamerica, cacao was not the sweet chocolate of the modern world. It was something older, darker, more bitter, and in many settings, far more meaningful. Among certain communities and societies, cacao could be prepared as a drink, sometimes mixed with other ingredients, poured, frothed, shared, valued, and remembered. It belonged not only to hunger, but to ceremony, exchange, status, and relationship. The cacao tree grew in warm, humid lands, where its pods hung close to the trunk like hidden vessels. Inside were seeds surrounded by pale pulp. Those seeds had to be fermented, dried, roasted, ground, and transformed before they became the deep-flavored food that people valued. Imagine the sound of grinding again, stone against stone, steady and patient. But this time, what rises is not the smell of grain. It is richer, earthier, almost smoky. The paste darkens under the hand. A vessel waits nearby. Liquid is poured from one container to another, lifted and dropped to make foam. The drink is not soft or sugary. It is strong, bitter, complex, a taste that asks attention. To drink cacao in such a world was not like opening a package or taking a casual sip. It could mark an occasion. It could carry meaning between people. It could belong to gatherings where words, gifts, agreements, or rituals mattered. And yet, even when cacao appears in elite or ceremonial contexts, we should not let grandeur erase labor. Before any cup was raised, someone tended trees. Someone harvested pods. Someone carried, dried, roasted, ground, mixed, and cleaned. The dignity of cacao begins not in the vessel, but in the hands. 2. Beans. Beans were quieter than cacao, less dramatic than bison, less bright than berries, less commanding than maize. But for many farming communities, beans were one of the great supports of life. Dried beans could wait. That was their power. In a storage room, inside a basket, tucked away after harvest, beans held food for later. They could be cooked into stews, softened over slow heat, mixed with maize, flavored with chili, enriched with meat or squash, or eaten as part of the daily rhythm of village life. They offered protein, strength, and balance. A bean field does not tell its story all at once. First, there is planting, then fragile leaves, then vines reaching, flowers opening, pods forming, drying, rattling softly when the season turns. At harvest, hands pull the pods free. Later, the beans are shelled. Small shapes falling into a container one by one, each one a future meal. In some agricultural systems, beans were grown with maize and squash, forming relationships that were both practical and symbolic. The maize rose upward. The bean vine climbed. The squash spread low across the ground, shading soil and helping hold moisture. Not every community used this system in the same way, and not every region farmed the same crops. But where it flourished, it showed a deep understanding of plants living together. Beans remind us that survival was not always loud. Sometimes it was a pot simmering for hours. Sometimes it was the patience to save seed. Sometimes it was the knowledge that strength could come from small things softened slowly in water. Picture an evening meal after a long day. The beans have been cooking since early light. Smoke has settled into clothing. A child waits too close to the fire. Someone stirs the pot with tired hands. The food is simple, but it is not poor. It is the result of planting, guarding, harvesting, drying, storing, and remembering how much a household will need before the next growing season returns. 1. Maize, and the fields that held squash beside it. If there is one food that reshaped much of ancient life in the Americas, it is maize. But maize should never be imagined as a lonely plant. In many places, it belonged to fields, to villages, to storage rooms, to grinding stones, to ceremonies, to trade, to daily meals, and to the hands of people who had spent generations learning how to grow it well. In some regions, it stood with beans and squash. In others, it was prepared and understood through local traditions shaped by climate, soil, water, and culture. 1,000 years ago, in parts of the Southwest, Mesoamerica, the eastern woodlands, and many other areas where maize agriculture had spread or developed in local ways, corn could anchor life. It could be eaten fresh, dried, ground into meal, shaped into cakes, cooked into porridges, wrapped, stored, traded, or carried. But before it became food, it demanded faith. A seed is placed into the earth. Nothing happens at first. The soil closes. The planter walks away. Then come days of watching, for rain, for birds, for insects, for frost, for heat, for signs that the field will live. Farming was hope made physical. It was risk placed carefully in rows. When maize rose, it changed the shape of a settlement. It asked for labor, weeding, watering where possible, guarding, harvesting, drying, storing, grinding. A field could feed, but it could also fail. A drought could turn confidence into fear. Too much rain could damage what people had counted on. The harvest was never guaranteed. And beside maize, squash carried its own quiet importance. Squash and pumpkins could be roasted, boiled, dried, stored, and used in many ways depending on the region. Their flesh brought sweetness and substance. Their seeds offered richness. Their hard rinds, in some varieties, could become useful containers or tools. In the field, their broad leaves spread low, touching the earth, holding shade near the roots of other plants. Imagine the harvest. Dry corn hangs in bundles. Squash rests near walls, heavy and round. Beans rattle in their pods. Smoke lifts from homes as evening comes. Somewhere, maize is being ground again, the same sound from the opening morning, the sound of stone, grain, and human persistence. The meal that follows may be humble, a bowl of corn mush, beans softened by fire, squash sweetened by heat, chili for warmth. But inside that bowl is a civilization of knowledge. It holds the memory of seed keepers, the labor of farmers, the patience of cooks, the eyes of hunters watching the weather, the hands of gatherers bringing berries, nuts, roots, and herbs from beyond the fields. It holds the rivers, deserts, forests, mountains, marshes, and plains. To ask what people ate in America 1,000 years ago is to ask how they lived with the world. There was no single ancient American table. There were many fires, many languages, many homes, many fields, many shorelines, many ways of giving thanks, feeding children, honoring animals, saving seeds, and surviving another winter. The foods were not primitive, they were precise, they were local, they were seasonal. They were the result of observation carried across generations. And if we listen closely, beyond the noise of the present, we can still hear the old rhythm, the crack of a nutshell, the tap of wild rice into a canoe, the hiss of fish over smoke, the soft scrape of a digging stick in mountain soil, the grinding of maize before dawn. 1,000 years have passed, but the memory of those meals has not disappeared. It remains in the land, in descendants, in seeds, in stories, and in every quiet act of preparing food with respect for the hands that came before.